was thrown into the snow with nothing but a blanket, and her fear, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, freezing and alone. But just when her last breath seemed near, something appeared through the white veil of the blizzard, and everything changed. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beneath a sky heavy with snow clouds, the wind howling across the frozen plains like the cry of 1,000 wolves. It was December 1876, and the winter had come early and merciless, transforming the landscape into a white desert, where death walked freely among those foolish enough to challenge nature's wrath. Elizabeth Hartford sat huddled in the back of the covered wagon, her arms wrapped tightly around her trembling body. At 23 years old, she had imagined her journey west would lead to a new beginning, a fresh start in the mining town of Silver Creek, where her late father's brother had promised her work at his general store. Instead, she found herself at the mercy of a man whose cruelty she had been too naive to recognize. "Please, Mr. Donovan," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "The storm is getting worse. We should find shelter." Jacob Donovan, a weathered man of 40 with cold gray eyes and a heart to match, spat tobacco juice into the snow and yanked hard on the reins of the two exhausted horses pulling the wagon. "Shelter costs money, woman. Money I ain't got thanks to your uncle failing to send the payment he promised for delivering you." Elizabeth's fingers clutched the thin wool blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders. The temperature had been dropping steadily for hours, and the snow had begun to fall in thick, blinding sheets. "My uncle is an honorable man. There must be some misunderstanding. When we reach Silver Creek, I'm certain he'll—" "Certain?" Donovan's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I'm certain of one thing, Miss Hartford. I'm done dragging dead weight across this godforsaken territory. You've been nothing but trouble since we left Fort Benton 3 days ago. Complaining about the cold, the food, the pace. Well, I've had my fill." The wagon lurched to a sudden stop, and Elizabeth felt her heart seize in her chest. Through the gap in the canvas covering, she could see nothing but an endless expanse of white, the landscape devoid of any landmark or sign of civilization. The nearest settlement had to be at least 2 days' ride away, possibly more in these conditions. "Mr. Donovan, what are you doing?" Fear crept into her voice as she watched him climb down from the driver's seat. He appeared at the back of the wagon, his face set in hard lines. "Get out." "What? No, you can't be serious. We're in the middle of nowhere. The storm—" "I said get out." His hand shot forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force and yanking her toward the edge of the wagon. Elizabeth struggled, her boots scrambling for purchase on the wooden floor, but Donovan was far stronger. With a final violent pull, he threw her from the wagon into the snow. Elizabeth landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. The cold bit through her dress immediately, seeping into her skin like 1,000 tiny knives. She pushed herself up on trembling arms, snow clinging to her dark hair and eyelashes. "Please," she begged, looking up at the man who had just condemned her to death. "Don't leave me here. I'll die." Donovan tossed her small traveling bag into the snow beside her. "Should have thought about that before your uncle decided to cheat me. Maybe dying out here will teach you Hartfords a lesson about keeping their word." "My uncle didn't cheat you. Please, just take me to the nearest town anywhere with people. I'll find a way to pay you, I swear it." But Donovan had already climbed back onto the wagon. With a sharp crack of the reins, the horses lurched forward, and Elizabeth watched in horror as her only means of survival disappeared into the white curtain of falling snow. His final words drifted back to her on the wind. "You want to survive. You figure it out yourself." For a long moment, Elizabeth simply knelt there in the snow, her mind refusing to accept the reality of her situation. The cold was already seeping deeper into her bones, and her fingers had begun to lose feeling despite being clutched together. The wind tore at her clothing, finding every gap and seam, stealing what little warmth her body produced. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaking from cold and fear. Her traveling bag lay half buried in the snow, and she grabbed it with numb fingers, clutching it to her chest. Inside were a few changes of clothes, a small amount of money, a tintype photograph of her parents, and a leather-bound journal her mother had given her before consumption had claimed her life 2 years ago. "Think, Elizabeth, think," she whispered to herself, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Her father had been a practical man, a teacher who had instilled in her the importance of keeping a clear head in crisis. But what could she possibly do now? She had no horse, no food beyond a few pieces of hardtack in her bag, and no knowledge of how to survive in this frozen wilderness. The snow was falling harder now, already beginning to cover the wagon tracks. Soon, there would be no trace that anyone had ever passed through this place. Elizabeth knew she had to move, had to find some kind of shelter before nightfall. But in which direction? Everything looked the same. Endless white in every direction, the horizon lost in the storm. She chose to walk in the direction the wagon had been heading before Donovan stopped. Perhaps if she followed the trail before it disappeared completely, she might find help. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. Each step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. Elizabeth's skirts, already heavy with moisture, dragged at her legs, making progress agonizingly slow. Her hands had gone completely numb, and she could no longer feel her feet inside her worn leather boots. The cold had moved beyond pain into something worse, a creeping numbness that she knew signaled the beginning of the end. Time lost all meaning. She might have been walking for an hour or 3. She couldn't tell. The light was fading. Whether from the approach of evening or the thickness of the storm, she didn't know. Her thoughts began to drift, becoming foggy and disconnected. She thought of her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, of her father reading to her by lamplight, of the apple tree in their yard back in Boston that bloomed every spring with flowers as white as this cursed snow. Elizabeth's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and she fell hard, lacking the strength to catch herself. She lay there for a moment, the cold snow against her cheek almost feeling warm now. That's when she knew she was dying. The stories she'd heard about freezing to death mentioned this, the false warmth, the overwhelming desire to simply lie down and sleep. "Get up," she told herself, her voice slurred. "Get up, Elizabeth." Mother didn't raise a quitter, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs felt impossibly heavy, as if the snow itself had soaked into her bones. She managed to roll onto her back, staring up at the darkening sky as snow fell onto her face. Perhaps this was God's plan for her all along. Perhaps she was meant to join her parents wherever they were now. A sound cut through the howling wind, something that didn't belong to the storm. Elizabeth's eyes, which had begun to close, snapped open. She heard it again, closer now. Hoofbeats. Someone was approaching on horseback. With the last of her strength, Elizabeth tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. She tried to raise her hand to signal, but her arm wouldn't move. The hoofbeats grew louder, and through her blurred vision she could make out a shape emerging from the white wall of snow. A horse, dark as night, appeared like a phantom from the storm. Upon its back sat a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs and leather. As the rider drew closer, Elizabeth could see him more clearly. A man with long black hair whipping in the wind, his face strong and angular, his eyes dark and intense as they settled upon her fallen form. He dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with a grace that seemed impossible in the deep snow. As he knelt beside her, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of intricate beadwork on his leather clothing, of feathers woven into his hair. A Blackfeet warrior, her fading mind registered. She'd heard stories about the Blackfeet during her journey west. Some spoke of their fierceness in battle, others of their deep knowledge of this harsh land. The warrior's hands, strong but surprisingly gentle, touched her face, tilting it toward him. He spoke words in a language she didn't understand, his voice deep and urgent. Elizabeth tried to respond, to tell him she couldn't feel anything anymore, that it was too late. But darkness was pulling at the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered before consciousness left her was the sensation of being lifted, of warmth surrounding her as the warrior wrapped her in his furs, and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait as they moved through the storm toward an unknown destination. Warmth. That was the first sensation that penetrated the fog of Elizabeth's consciousness. Not the false warmth of freezing to death, but real, blessed heat that seemed to seep into her frozen limbs like water into parched earth. She became aware of softness beneath her, of furs piled around her body, of the crackle and pop of a fire nearby. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but she forced them open. The world came into focus slowly. A curved ceiling made of animal hides stretched over wooden poles, smoke rising toward a small opening at the top where she could see the night sky. The storm still raged outside, but here, in this shelter, she was protected from its fury. "You wake." The voice was deep, accented, speaking English with careful precision. Elizabeth turned her head toward the sound and found the warrior sitting a few feet away, tending the fire. In the flickering light, she could see him more clearly now. He appeared to be in his late 20s, his features strong and handsome, his long black hair falling past his shoulders. He wore simple buckskin clothing, and around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise stones. "Where?" Elizabeth's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Her throat felt raw, and her body ached in ways she'd never experienced. The warrior rose and moved toward her with that same fluid grace she'd noticed before. He knelt beside the pile of furs where she lay and lifted a waterskin to her lips. "Drink. Slow." The water was cold and sweet, and Elizabeth had never tasted anything better. She drank carefully, following his instruction, and when she'd had enough, he set the waterskin aside and studied her face with those intense dark eyes. "You are fortunate," he said. "Another hour in the storm, and the spirits would have claimed you. Your fingers, your toes, they live, but they will hurt for many days as the feeling returns." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, which were wrapped in soft leather bindings. She could feel a painful tingling sensation in her fingertips, a sign that circulation was returning. "You saved my life," she whispered, looking back at him. "Thank you. I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Hartford." The warrior nodded once. "I am called Lone Eagle by my people. You are far from any white settlement. How did you come to be alone in the storm?" The memories came flooding back. Donovan's cruelty, being thrown from the wagon, the desperate struggle through the snow. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "The man who was taking me to Silver Creek, where my uncle lives. He abandoned me. He said my uncle hadn't paid him, though I know that can't be true. He just left me there to die." Something dark flashed in Lone Eagle's eyes, an anger that made Elizabeth suddenly aware of the knife at his belt, the bow and quiver of arrows resting against the wall of the lodge. "This man, he is a coward and without honor. No true warrior would leave a woman to face the winter alone. I thought I was going to die," Elizabeth admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't feel anything anymore. I couldn't move. And then you appeared, like something from a dream." Lone Eagle added more wood to the fire, his movements economical and practiced. "I was returning to my winter camp when I saw the wagon tracks, then your footprints. I followed them and found you. The Great Spirit guided me to you for a reason, Elizabeth Hartford." She watched him as he worked, noting the quiet confidence in everything he did. There was a peacefulness about him that seemed at odds with the fierce warrior image she'd been taught to fear. "Your winter camp, is it far from here?" "Half a day's ride in good weather. I was scouting when the storm came. This is a temporary shelter I use when hunting." He gestured to the lodge around them. "We will remain here until the storm passes. It would be death to travel now, even for one who knows this land well." Elizabeth realized suddenly that she was wearing different clothes, a soft doeskin dress that wasn't hers. Heat flooded her cheeks. "My clothes were wet and freezing," Lone Eagle said matter-of-factly, not looking at her. "I removed them to save your life. They hang there, drying." He pointed to where her dress and undergarments were suspended near the fire. "I gave you the dress that belonged to my sister. She would want you to have it. Your sister. She walks with the spirits now. 3 winters ago, the spotted sickness took her." There was grief in his voice, old but still present. "Her name was Morning Star. She was kind like you seem to be." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "I lost my parents too. My mother 2 years ago, my father last year. That's why I was traveling to my uncle. I have no one else." Lone Eagle met her eyes, and in that moment Elizabeth felt a connection spark between them. Two people who had known loss, who understood the weight of grief. "Then we are both alone," he said quietly. "But perhaps the Great Spirit brought us together so we would not have to carry our burdens by ourselves." The wind howled outside, shaking the lodge's walls, but inside, the fire burned warm and steady. Lone Eagle prepared a simple meal of dried meat, and something that looked like a thick paste made from berries and fat. He explained it was called pemmican, a traveling food his people made to sustain them through the long winters. As they ate, Elizabeth found herself watching him, fascinated by everything about him. His world was so different from hers, yet sitting here in the firelight, sharing food and stories, the differences seemed less important than the things they had in common. "Tell me about your people," she asked. "The Blackfeet. I've heard stories, but I don't know what's true and what's just fear talking." Lone Eagle was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "My people are the Picani, one of the 3 tribes the whites call Blackfeet. We are warriors, yes, we defend our land and our way of life. But we are also fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters. We laugh, we love, we grieve. We are not so different from your people, Elizabeth Hartford." "I can see that now," she said, "though I admit I was afraid when I first saw you, not because of anything you did, but because of what I'd been told to expect. And now?" Elizabeth smiled, the first real smile since her ordeal began. "Now I see the man who saved my life, the man who gave me his sister's dress and shared his food. I see someone honorable." Something shifted in Lone Eagle's expression, a warmth entering his eyes that made Elizabeth's heart beat a little faster. "You are not like other white women I have encountered. They look at me and see only a savage. You look at me and see a person. Because that's what you are," Elizabeth said simply. "A person who showed me more kindness in one evening than Jacob Donovan showed me in 3 days." They talked long into the night, the storm raging outside while they shared stories of their lives. Lone Eagle spoke of growing up in the shadow of the great mountains, of learning to hunt from his father, of the changing world that threatened his people's way of life. Elizabeth told him about Boston, about her father's school, about the books she loved and the dreams she'd had before death and circumstance had stolen them away. "You speak of your uncle's store in Silver Creek," Lone Eagle said as the fire burned lower. "Is this what you want? To spend your days measuring flour and selling tools to miners?" Elizabeth pulled the furs closer around her shoulders, considering the question. "I don't know what I want anymore. A month ago I thought I wanted safety, a place to belong. But now," she trailed off, uncertain how to express the strange feeling growing inside her. "Now you have seen that the world is larger and more dangerous than you knew," Lone Eagle finished for her. "And perhaps more beautiful too." "Yes," Elizabeth whispered, looking at him across the fire. "More beautiful than I imagined." Their eyes met and held, and Elizabeth felt something stir in her chest, something she'd never felt before. It was more than gratitude, deeper than simple attraction. In Lone Eagle's steady gaze, she saw strength and gentleness combined, a man who had faced the harshness of this land and remained kind despite it. Lone Eagle looked away first, rising to check the lodge's entrance where snow had begun to drift against the hide covering. "The storm will pass by morning. When it does, I will take you to Silver Creek if that is your wish. Or," he paused, turning back to face her, "or I will take you to my winter camp. My people would welcome you. You could stay until spring, learn our ways. When the snow melts, you could choose your path with clear mind." "Stay with you?" Elizabeth's heart raced at the thought. "But I'm a white woman. Wouldn't your people object?" "Some might question at first," Lone Eagle admitted, "but you would be under my protection. No one would harm you or force you to leave. My grandmother Spotted Fawn, she is the eldest of our band. She is wise and would understand that the spirits brought you to me for a purpose." Elizabeth's mind whirled with possibilities. Common sense told her she should go to her uncle, settle into the life that had been planned. But her heart was telling her something entirely different. Here was a chance to step into a world she'd never imagined, to learn and grow and perhaps find something she hadn't even known she was searching for. "I need to think," she said finally. "Can I give you my answer in the morning?" "Of course." Lone Eagle moved to the opposite side of the lodge, where he'd laid out his own sleeping furs. "Rest now, Elizabeth Hartford. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it, your choice." But sleep didn't come easily to Elizabeth. She lay awake, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminish, thinking about everything that had happened. Just hours ago, she'd been certain she would die. Now she was alive, warm, and facing a decision that would change the course of her entire life. She thought about her uncle, a man she'd never met but who had written kind letters after her father's death. She thought about the safety and predictability of life in a mining town. Then she thought about Lone Eagle, about the way he'd looked at her across the fire, about the gentle strength in his hands when he'd helped her drink, about the pain in his voice when he spoke of his lost sister. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having exhausted itself during the night. Elizabeth woke to find Lone Eagle already awake, preparing tea from pine needles in a small pot over the rekindled fire. The morning light filtered through the smoke hole above, casting everything in a soft golden glow. "Good morning," she said, pushing herself up to sitting. The pain in her fingers and toes had intensified overnight, just as Lone Eagle had warned, but she could move them now, which seemed a miracle in itself. Lone Eagle turned to her, and Elizabeth caught her breath at the sight of him in the morning light. There was something striking about him, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from his very being. "Good morning, Elizabeth Hartford. The storm has passed. Today we must decide your path." He handed her a cup of the pine needle tea, and their fingers brushed as she took it. The contact sent a jolt through her, and from the way Lone Eagle's eyes widened slightly, she knew he'd felt it too. She sipped the tea, finding it bitter but warming, and gathered her courage. "I've made my decision," she said, looking directly at him. "I want to go with you to your winter camp. I want to learn about your people, your ways. My uncle doesn't even know exactly when I'm arriving. Donovan was supposed to send word from the last settlement, but I doubt he did. A few more months won't matter, and perhaps I need this. Perhaps I need to discover who I am before I settle into who I'm expected to be." The smile that spread across Lone Eagle's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You honor me and my people with your trust, Elizabeth Hartford. I promise you will be safe and welcomed." They packed quickly, Lone Eagle moving with efficient grace while Elizabeth did her best to help despite her still recovering body. He had fashioned snowshoes from branches and sinew during the night, and he showed her how to strap them to her feet. Her own clothes had dried by the fire, but Lone Eagle suggested she keep wearing Morningstar's dress beneath her own for extra warmth, and Elizabeth agreed, touched by the gesture. The journey to the winter camp took most of the day, but it was nothing like the desperate struggle through the storm. Lone Eagle's horse, a magnificent black stallion he called Shadow Runner, carried them both across the snow-covered landscape. Elizabeth sat in front of Lone Eagle, his arms around her as he guided the horse, and she felt safer than she had in months. As they rode, Lone Eagle pointed out landmarks and taught her words in his language. "Oki," he said, pointing to the sky. "Natosi, the sun. Sistikom, our mother, the earth." Elizabeth repeated the words, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. But Lone Eagle was patient, correcting her gently. "You learn quickly," he said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "My grandmother will be pleased. She loves to teach, but few have the patience to listen anymore." "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said, leaning back slightly against Lone Eagle's chest. She felt him stiffen at first, then gradually relax, accepting her closeness. "Spotted Fawn has seen 70 winters," he began. "She is small but fierce like the wolverine. When I was a boy and my mother died bringing my brother into the world, a brother who did not survive, it was Spotted Fawn who raised me. She taught me the stories of our people, the prayers, the right way to walk in this world. She will see your heart, Elizabeth, and know you are meant to be here." "I hope you're right," Elizabeth murmured. "I'm frightened, if I'm honest. Not of being hurt, but of not being accepted, of being alone in a place full of people." Lone Eagle's arms tightened slightly around her. "You will not be alone. I will stand beside you. This I promise." They crested a ridge in the late afternoon, and Lone Eagle drew Shadow Runner to a halt. Below them, nestled in a protected valley beside a partially frozen river, stood the winter camp. Elizabeth counted perhaps 20 lodges, smoke rising from their tops into the clear blue sky. People moved among the structures, going about their daily tasks, and she could hear the distant sounds of children laughing and dogs barking. "My home," Lone Eagle said quietly. "And now, if you wish it, yours as well." As they descended into the valley, people began to notice their arrival. Elizabeth felt dozens of eyes upon her, saw the surprise and curiosity on faces young and old. A group of warriors approached, and Lone Eagle raised his hand in greeting, calling out in his own language. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Elizabeth down. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Lone Eagle steadied her, his hands warm and strong on her waist, and for a moment they stood close together, his face just inches from hers. "Trust me," he whispered in English, then turned to address his people. Elizabeth couldn't understand most of what he said, but she caught her name and heard him use the word for storm. Sokoyi. The warriors listened intently, their expressions shifting from suspicion to understanding as Lone Eagle spoke. Finally, one of them, a man with gray streaking his hair and a scar across his cheek, stepped forward and addressed Lone Eagle in a serious tone. "Running Wolf wishes to know if you claim protection over you." Lone Eagle translated for Elizabeth. "I will tell him yes, that you are under my care and no harm must come to you. Is this acceptable?" "Yes," Elizabeth said firmly, looking Running Wolf in the eye. "Please tell him I'm grateful for the shelter, and that I wish to learn from his people." Lone Eagle translated, and Running Wolf studied Elizabeth for a long moment before nodding slowly. He spoke again, and this time Elizabeth caught a word she recognized. "Spotted Fawn. He says my grandmother wishes to meet you," Lone Eagle said. "Come." They walked through the camp, Elizabeth acutely aware of the stares following them. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, and groups of women paused in their work to watch them pass. But Lone Eagle walked with his head high, Elizabeth at his side, projecting a confidence that helped calm her racing heart. The largest lodge stood at the center of the camp, and as they approached, the entrance flap was pulled aside. An elderly woman emerged, small and wizened but with eyes that seemed to see everything. She wore a dress decorated with intricate quill work, and her long gray hair was braided with strips of red cloth. Spotted Fawn looked at Elizabeth, then at Lone Eagle, and spoke in rapid Blackfeet. Lone Eagle responded, gesturing to Elizabeth, and the old woman's expression softened. She stepped forward and, to Elizabeth's surprise, reached out to touch her face with weathered fingers. "Your heart is good," Spotted Fawn said in heavily accented English. "I see it in your eyes. You have known pain. You have known loss. This makes you strong, yes?" "I try to be strong," Elizabeth replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Your grandson saved my life. I owe him everything." Spotted Fawn smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "My grandson needs someone to save him too, not from storm but from loneliness. His heart has been winter since Morning Star left us, but now," she looked between them knowingly, "now perhaps spring comes." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth settled into the rhythm of life in the winter camp. Spotted Fawn took her under her wing, teaching her the language, the customs, the skills she would need to survive. Elizabeth learned to tan hides, to sew with bone needles and sinew thread, to prepare pemmican and dried meat. Her hands, soft from years of civilized life, grew calloused and strong. But it was the time she spent with Lone Eagle that truly transformed her. Every evening, after the day's work was done, he would come to Spotted Fawn's lodge where Elizabeth was staying, and they would walk together through the camp or sit by the river talking about everything and nothing. "You're different here," Lone Eagle observed one evening as they sat watching the sun set over the mountains. "When I found you in the snow, you were like a frightened bird. Now you laugh with the children and argue with Spotted Fawn about the proper way to scrape a hide." Elizabeth smiled, pulling the fur robe Spotted Fawn had given her closer against the cold. "I feel different. I feel alive in a way I haven't since my parents died. Like I'm not just existing, but actually living. This pleases me," Lone Eagle said softly. He reached out and took her hand, the first time he'd done so since that moment when he'd helped her from the horse. "Elizabeth, I must tell you something. My heart has been cold for a long time, frozen like the river. But you have brought warmth to it, like the first sun of spring breaking the ice. I did not expect this. I did not plan for this, but I cannot deny what I feel." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "Lone Eagle, let me finish," he said gently. "In my culture, when a man wishes to court a woman, he brings gifts to her family, proves he can provide and protect. But you have no family here except Spotted Fawn, and she has already told me she approves of my feelings for you. What I want to know is, do you feel the same? Could you see yourself staying here not as a guest but as one of us, as my woman? Tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes, but they were tears of joy. I fell in love with you the moment you wrapped me in your furs and carried me through the storm, she admitted. I've just been too afraid to say it, afraid that I was imagining the way you looked at me, the gentleness in your touch. Yes, Lone Eagle. Yes to all of it. Lone Eagle pulled her close, and Elizabeth went willingly into his arms. He held her against his chest, and she could hear the steady beating of his heart. Then when spring comes and the snows melt, we will be married in the way of my people. And if you wish, we can also marry in the way of your people so that both worlds recognize our union. I don't need the approval of both worlds, Elizabeth whispered against his chest. I only need you. They sat together as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's warmth, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Montana sky. Elizabeth thought of Jacob Donovan, of how his cruelty had inadvertently led her to this moment, to this man, to this new life that felt more right than anything she'd ever known. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Elizabeth continued to learn and grow, becoming more proficient in the language and customs every day. The people of the camp, seeing Lone Eagle's devotion to her and her genuine respect for their ways, gradually accepted her as one of their own. The children especially loved her, clustering around when she told them stories from the books she'd read in her old life, tales of far-off places that seemed as exotic to them as their world once had to her. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land, the camp prepared for the wedding ceremony. Spotted Fawn had been working for weeks on a special dress for Elizabeth, decorated with beadwork that told the story of how she and Lone Eagle had met, a woman lost in a storm, a warrior guided by the spirits, two hearts finding each other in the wilderness. The ceremony was held on the first warm day of spring, with the entire camp gathered to witness. Elizabeth stood beside Lone Eagle, wearing the beautiful dress Spotted Fawn had made, her dark hair braided with white feathers. Lone Eagle wore his finest ceremonial clothing, his face painted with symbols of protection and love. The elder who performed the ceremony spoke of the Great Spirit's wisdom in bringing two people from different worlds together, of how love could bridge any divide. He bound Elizabeth's and Lone Eagle's hands together with a leather cord, symbolizing their eternal connection, and had them exchange vows before the assembled people. I promise to walk beside you through all seasons, Lone Eagle said, his voice strong and clear. To hunt for you, to protect you, to honor you all the days of my life. I promise to stand with you through all hardships, Elizabeth replied, her voice equally firm. To support you, to love you, to build a life with you that honors both the world I came from and the world I've chosen. As the ceremony concluded, the camp erupted in celebration. There was feasting and dancing, songs and stories, laughter and joy. Elizabeth danced with her new husband under the stars, surrounded by people who had become her family, and knew that she had found where she truly belonged. Late that night, as the celebration finally wound down, Elizabeth and Lone Eagle stood together outside the new lodge the camp had built for them as a wedding gift. Lone Eagle took both her hands in his and looked into her eyes with an expression of such love that it took her breath away. No regrets? He asked softly. No thoughts of the life you left behind? Elizabeth thought of her uncle's store in Silver Creek, of the safe, predictable life she might have had. Then she thought of everything she'd gained: love, purpose, a family, a home where she was valued not for what was expected of her, but for who she truly was. No regrets, she said firmly. Only gratitude. Gratitude